Hey, it's Chris, and today we have a little rant that's been very long in coming. I think I've made it pretty clear that I love the Fire Emblem series, I love Fire Emblem Three Houses, I think it has some spectacular character writing, character design, but in terms of plot, I think really all four routes kind of have their issues. But Crimson Flower really stood out to me in that regard, and it's been really getting at me, really under my skin, really ever since I played it. This is one of those like kind of obsessive things that wiggled its way into my brain and simply has not left. So we're going to exercise that demon together today. First, real quick though, some art stuff. The footage that I have for us today is all about coloring Edelgard in this. I mentioned last video, this was a commission, and I tried kind of a funky thing with the coloring. I don't actually know how well it worked, to be honest. I tried using cooler, kind of blue-leaning colors for the shading and toning and rendering for Edelgard, and warmer red-leaning colors for Dimitri, to sort of get their color palettes to meet in the middle a little bit. I have no idea how well that went. I guess you might not even know until the next video where I have the footage of coloring Dimitri too. But anyway, I'm pretty happy with how she came out. Enjoy watching that. And final note, like I said, this is a commission, so if you do feel like chatting with me about that, or just looking at my art, my shit posting, whatever, come over and find me on Instagram. I'll have the link in the description for that. Maybe some other socials too. I don't know. I'm everywhere and also not checking any of it. On to what I'm sure will be a completely amicable and non-controversial topic. Edelgard stands. Is your waifu trash? That's not at all. That's not what this video is. I'm sorry. Please don't hate me. But for real, I had some issues with the route. It's one of those I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed kind of things, really, because I played Crimson Flower last of all the routes. I had already done every other route plus the DLC, and I was so ready to go into that thing and have just my mind blown and have the whole plot of the game, everything that I had learned, completely turned upside down and just change how I thought about everything that I had seen so far. And then it just didn't happen like that. That didn't happen. I know that the game's development was rushed in a lot of ways. I know there were some corners that had to be cut. This route, though, fell short in some ways that I found uniquely disappointing because I felt that it didn't deliver on A, what it was promising subtextually, or B, it didn't really live up to its own potential. I think that people who say that their favorite route was Crimson Flower, well, most of them that I've spoken to have actually not played any of the other routes, which is fair. You can't skip the school phase, so I understand not wanting to play multiple routes if you're not as in love with the game as I am. So most people who said that their favorite route was Crimson Flower, it's either because of lack of exposure to the others, or I think because they're really seeing the potential of the route that, in my opinion, simply was not met. So, the whole Crimson Flower route really is contingent upon Edelgard herself. Edelgard's whole deal is that she hates the church because of how they uphold this societal obsession with crests. Crests, of course, being something that you just kind of luck your way into, and then they just make your life easier from then on out. Harder in some ways, but mostly it's the privileged stamp of approval in this society, right? So Edelgard has all this trauma, all this torture, all this awful things that have been done to her because of this whole crest system. We don't have time to go into all that. I'm assuming if you're watching this video, you already kind of know what the deal is with that. But the very short version is crests are so super important that her family, being the heirs to the Adressian Empire, it was considered extremely essential that their heir have a powerful crest. None of the children did naturally, so a lot of inhumane experiments were done on them to try to make that happen. And Edelgard is marginally a success of that experimentation, but not great things. Not great things happened. Lots of dungeon torture and locking children underground and that sort of thing. So that's where the whole conflict for everything is rooted. Now, discussing the issues that I have with this route, I pretty much organize these points into Edelgard problems and Crimson Flower problems. There are some issues that I think are rooted in how Edelgard was written and portrayed, and some issues that I believe are a part of the core structure of the route. It's a little bit messy. I did my best to organize it. Let's go. And we're starting with Edelgard issues because, hey, I didn't want to live that much longer anyway. All right, we start with this issue of, A, the church has this system where crests rule our lives and it's terrible and people get abused over it all the time. It sucks. Other issue, the church is run by lizard people. Now, leaving aside the racial genocide aspect of Edelgard's whole plan, we'll get to that later, who told her that the church was run by lizard people? Because, as far as I can tell, it could have only been the Agarthians. Now, the Agarthians, again, those that slither in the dark, so named by Hubert, our favorite edgy rat man. I love Hubert, don't at me. So the Slitheries, they tell Edelgard the church is run by lizard people, this whole Crest situation is their fault, right? And we, as the player, know that that's more or less correct, if lacking in some nuance, but Edelgard really has less than zero reason to be listening to these people. They're about the most biased source possible, and Edelgard herself has absolutely no justification for giving them an ounce of her attention in terms of their own beliefs. Heck, if I were one of the Agarthians and I noticed that she was just taking us at our word about everything, I would start to think of what other awesome things we could get the next emperor to believe that would benefit us. So we end up with this situation where really Edelgard's only true justification for her actions is poorly sourced information from the very people who abused her and misplaced emotional trauma. And it doesn't really get better where the Agarthians are concerned for her route, because you really spend the entire time with her working with them knowingly and willingly, when they've objectively done so much worse than Rhea, and have nuclear weapons, by the way, but we just gloss over that. That's fine. We don't have to worry about that. And there's all this lip service paid to the idea that, oh, well, the Agarthians will get theirs eventually. Hubert talks about, oh, well, once we're done just using them for our own purposes, then I'll go and just murk all of them. It'll be fine. Don't worry about it. But really, from start to finish, Edelgard does exactly what the Agarthians want. They say to her as the Flame Emperor that they gave her power so that she could even destroy a god, and yeah, you do exactly that. That's the final battle, so I guess that's the narrative climax of Edelgard's arc, is doing the thing that her abusers told her to do. Alright, moving away from the Agarthians, we'll talk a little bit more about them later with the route issues. Other Edelgard problems, let's get these other ones out of the way pretty quickly. Now, it's not like this is unprecedented in real life, but it does not feel good from a constructed narrative standpoint, wherein I am a person playing a video game and playing through a story and being the protagonist. You fight authoritarianism with authoritarianism. Other more intelligent and more politically aware people than myself have already talked about this point at length, the fact that Edelgard basically takes a look at this corrupted societal cultural system that has the continent more or less under its thumb and says, you know how I can fix this? By violently taking over the entire continent, and then it will be under my thumb instead, which to me seems like a win-win. Now granted, this is kind of a problem I have with every route in this game, the fact that no matter which route you choose, you end up with a united continent of Foldland, which to me is misguided. I'm of the opinion that the separate countries had their own strengths, had their own cultures, and that unifying the continent is basically an act of aggressive colonialism. Like I said, more intelligent political minds have engaged with that idea, but I needed to put it on the table because it definitely was nudging the back of my brain while I was playing this whole thing. I did not feel like the hero. I never felt like I was doing the right thing for the continent, not really in any of the routes, but especially not in Edelgard's. Semi-related to that point, and one that I feel much more confidently indignant about, Edelgard's ultimate goal is basically racial genocide because one of them is a crazy person, right? The church is run by lizard people. This is, for some reason, a bad thing? Question mark. I don't see why them being lizard people really, actually impacts anything functionally. For all intents and purposes, one of them is crazy. Rhea's nuts. She, something about her needs to be done. I definitely get that. I fully support that. Sedith is just trying to be a single dad. I don't know, someone buy him a George Foreman and an apron and he'll be happy with whatever. And Flayn is just, being the cutest in the universe, right? And Sedith and Flayn can't even transform anymore, so they effectively are living as just immortal regular people. Both seem totally fine with just vibing. And then the only other two members of the Nabateans that are still alive are Indek and Macuel, and they've both just screwed off to some other remote place on the continent and really aren't bothering anybody who doesn't come to bother them. They're just chilling too. Everybody's vibing. The Nabateans are just vibing, and Edelgard looks at that, narrows her eyes, and says, Can't have that. But I think essentially what this whole issue boils down to is just that Edelgard has a problem with one extraordinarily influential person, and instead of also being an extraordinarily influential person and dealing with this through the channels that the powers that be normally would, she decides to do a big ol' heckin' genocide instead and take over the continent by force. And there are so many logical leaps and bounds that it takes to get to that point that the game and Edelgard herself just do not seem equipped to approach in a thoughtful or critical sense at all, really. Finally, as far as my Edelgard specific problems, she's just a dick about your dad dying. Like, honestly, what the hell? Like, literally everybody in the monastery is nicer about that, including Hubert. When Hubert has out-empathied you, you need to do some personal reflection. And, like, yes, the excuse that both the game and a lot of Edelgard fans like to give is, but her trauma. Trauma does cause people to behave in certain ways that aren't always logical, don't always align with common values. That being said, other characters in this game who experience trauma of equal severity, shall we say, are generally called out for being shitty. There is pretty much nobody who calls out Edelgard in her route, and so her personal flaws tend to go more or less unchallenged. They kind of imply that Ferdinand is supposed to be somebody who, like, verbally duels with her from time to time, but we never get to see that, at least not in any significant way. There's no counterpoint in her route to her beliefs, other than occasional glimpses of people like Rhea being like, sure sucks that she's crazy and violent and bad. So yeah, TLDR, as far as Edelgard's writing specifically, I found her beliefs to be poorly founded, taken from extraordinarily questionable sources, given very little development outside of just the framework of her own emotional baggage. Add that to unjustified aggression and authoritarian methodology, working alongside the Agarthians, pretty much doing exactly what they wanted, and just generally kind of being a racist dick. God, that's like so mean. I really want to reinstate the fact that this is all coming from a place of the high hopes that I had for the route and for Edelgard as a character. If you love them, I totally get it. I really do. The potential was there. I'm just saying I think that a lot of things remained underdeveloped that were actually pretty crucial to really sticking the landing with this intriguing concept that they started with her. Now, root problems, I want to start with something we've already touched on, which is the fact that the Agarthians go pretty much unpunished in this route, which seems extremely strange to me because in other routes they are addressed. In other routes, going to fight them is kind of your big climax of the whole game, right? So it seems completely bizarre to me that the whole justification for this extremely important alliance between Edelgard's forces and the Agarthians, the whole justification was that you were going to go slap them around later, and you never get to actually do that. You're just promised that Hubert's going to go deal with it. And now the reason I bring this up again already is that the route is just too short. It's like 4 or 5 chapters shorter than any of the other routes. People have already harped on this, not going to sit on this for too long. It's just a crying shame. For all that they were trying to conceptually do in this route, there was no justification for it being the shortest by that wide of a margin. And it could have easily been filled out by just including that huge dangling thread of the Agarthians to tie up at the end. And hell, the game even had the perfect opportunity to plant the seeds for this later down the line. There's this school phase trip that you go on with Edelgard, this little field trip you go on with her, and you're going back to the Empire, and this would have been a perfect opportunity for Edelgard to say, well, you know, here's where I learned all these things about the church, here's what my grand plan is, blah, 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 blah. I know we're trying to portray her as somebody who keeps her cards close to the chest, but the way this whole route is structured, you don't actually know anything about her situation until you've already decided to follow her. So that school phase trip would have been a great circumstance to just flesh out all of her various beliefs, solidify that bond with Byleth, and also plant the seed of, okay, here's the deal with the Agarthians, here's my plan for dealing with them later. I'm trusting you to not screw up this temporary alliance, and I know that this is going to be hard for you, but we'll have retribution for all of this. And instead you just go and say hi to Edelgard's dad and then go home. Second root issue. Nothing bad really happens when you're following Edelgard. To you, I mean. A lot of bad things happen to other people. Because of you. When you're playing through the Crimson Flower route, things just kind of go well for you all the time. You lose, Rudolph and Ladislava. I had to write down their names because they matter so little. These two random side characters who apparently are friends of Edelgard's. They partake in a couple battles and then die. And that's about that for them. They die and they're these meaningless token deaths to just make it seem like sacrifices are being made. No sacrifices are being made. It does not feel heroic to play the Crimson Flower route because there's none of that narrative tension of having to triumph over insurmountable odds or anything like that. You pretty much just steamroll the continent. Edelgard also does not grow or change at all during this route. That's similar to the whole this does not feel like a hero's narrative kind of issue. And this is why I place this as a root issue, right? Because I think this all could have easily been salvaged by just committing to having Crimson Flower be the villain route. That would have been the right framework for all of these issues, but because they've decided that they want to frame Edelgard's route as more or less equivalent to any of the others in terms Screw it, I'm keeping that in terms of moral gray area. Now, for this next one, I want to remind you that we're kind of talking about a meta narrative here, and so by that I mean people are sometimes inconsistent in real life. People are sometimes confusing and strange and weird. But in constructed narratives, in a game with a story that is being marketed as being very story and character focused, we need to think about why characters were written a certain way and the cohesiveness of their arc as a whole. And so where we run into an issue with that here is that in Edelgard's route, a lot of the characters in the Black Eagles come out of this situation looking worse for having followed her. To really, really dissect this point, I would need like a video per character to go into their whole arc, depending on which route you take them through, right? But just as a quick example, Petra is one that really got under my skin. In the church route, her narrative arc is that she's a political prisoner standing up to her oppressor in the form of both Edelgard as a representative of the Empire, but also just the Empire as a whole. And she comes into her own to fight against that, to protect people that she's come to love despite her circumstances. It's a very heartfelt kind of arc, a story of somebody really committing to the bonds that they've forged in their lives despite the expectations placed upon them politically or societally or what have you. And that would be very much in line with a lot of the themes that this game has tried to engage with consistently in other character arcs as well. In the Crimson Flower route, Petra's story is one of a political prisoner being just peachy keen with the relationship between her and her oppressor, and just playing nice and going along with everything. And yes, in real life, this is just as likely to happen. In fact, probably more likely to happen for people in this kind of circumstance, historically speaking. But in a constructed narrative, in a piece of entertainment media, that is so damn depressing. And like I said, it's inconsistent with the themes of the rest of the game thus far. Okay, this last one, I gotta admit, I wasn't super sure where to put this because it's kind of a weird issue. I already said I like Hubert, but the reason why is a little bit strange. I find Hubert really fascinating as a narrative device. In universe, it's stated a few times that Hubert essentially exists to keep Edelgard's hands clean. He's there to do the dirty business so that she is never called upon to do it, and her ambition can still be fulfilled without the need for any of the less savory things to fall on her as emperor. But fascinatingly, I have actually seen Hubert more or less functioning that way in the meta existence of this game as well. So by that I mean fans of Crimson Flower and fans of Edelgard will frequently deflect all of the cruel and horrible things that had to happen either onto the Agarthians, which we already discussed there's not really much justification for her alliance with them, and they aren't dealt with in the structure of the narrative, so we really don't have that conclusion to that and that justification. Or they'll say, okay, well that was a sketchy Hubert thing there, that was something that he dealt with. So really both in the text and metatextually, Hubert is this wonderful device that can be used, and I think it's reflected too in the fact that he really is designed like a Disney villain. Everything about him is so hilariously evil and intimidating seeming, and I know that we do get to learn that he's a little bit deeper than that, but I just think it's fascinating that he's placed there clearly for a very specific purpose, and both in the game and outside of it, he succeeds marvelously. That being said, Hubert and Edelgard's A support conversation makes me break out in hives. It's one of the worst bits of writing I've ever seen in my life. He just says that he's in love with her, and she goes, "That's cool," and that's it. And it's the most painful thing in the world, and it undermines everything interesting about Hubert as a character, and I hate it so much. I refuse to acknowledge that it's canon. It's bad. In my opinion, this is just more evidence that Edelgard's route should have just been a villain route, though. The fact that you have Hubert there as this excellent narrative device, it would have been a great commentary to examine the ways in which demagogues can deflect onto their allies, employees, what have you, in order to maintain their own image. But Fire Emblem Three Houses is not ready for that conversation, I guess. And really, I think that's pretty much the takeaway here. This game set up so many interesting concepts, so many conversations that could be had about the lifelong repercussions of certain types of abuse, the moral gray area of warfare in general, but especially one that is so motivated by personal, emotional convictions, just so many different issues here that we could be talking about. The game just wasn't ready to fully engage in what it was trying to bring to the table, at least not in this route specifically. So, yeah, try not to take this as just angry idiot yells at video game. It was really more of a kind of post-mortem for something that could have been so much more than it turned out to be. If Crimson Flower is still your favorite route, then more power to you, but I just can't help but reflect on what we could have gotten instead of a very messy and very ill-justified and very rushed narrative that we ended up with. So, I don't really believe in critiquing without also trying to be productive. Especially as a creative, I think it's my obligation to engage with things more seriously than just whining about them mindlessly. So I would love to do another video on this topic. I'd love to talk about what my ideal Crimson Flower route would look like, what kind of changes that would involve, and hopefully it won't take another 3 months or whatever to get it out, because I have the footage for Dimitri's coloring process too, and I'm pretty happy with it. So like I said, come talk to me about commissions or just say hi over on social media if you like. You guys have a stellar day. Keep enjoying things, keep liking things, and I will see you next time.